January 17, 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls in thick, silent curtains across the Belgian countryside, each flake catching what little light seeps through the overcast sky. In a concealed position behind a grove of frost-laden pine trees, Oberst Heinrich Müller adjusts his field glasses, scanning the American lines 2 kilometers distant. The cold metal of the binoculars stings against his weathered face as he studies the enemy positions through the winter haze. His breath forms clouds in the frigid air, dissipating quickly in the wind that carries the distant sound of American vehicles moving supplies forward. Behind him, his artillery battery 4 105mm howitzers sits positioned with Germanic precision, each gun meticulously camouflaged beneath white canvas and pine boughs. The gunners stamp their feet against the cold, their faces red with the bite of winter, waiting for the order that would send high explosive shells screaming toward the American positions. Müller lowers his glasses and checks his watch. 847 hours. In 13 minutes his battery would commence a carefully planned bombardment of the American forward positions, timed to coordinate with infantry attacks across the sector. This was how artillery had always worked. You positioned your guns beyond the range of enemy observation. You calculated your firing solutions with mathematical precision. You fired your missions, and then you displaced to avoid counter-battery fire the Americans. Müller had been told by his superiors were competent enough soldiers, but their artillery was crude, wasteful, and lacking in the scientific precision that German gunnery had perfected over decades of warfare. The wind shifts, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and diesel exhaust from the American lines. Müller raises his glasses again, noting the movement of trucks and half-tracks in the distance. American abundance, he thinks with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. They had more of everything, more vehicles, more fuel, more ammunition than they knew what to do with. But quantity, as every German officer knew, was no substitute for quality and tactical sophistication. At precisely 0900 hours, Müller's battery opens fire. The first salvo of high explosive shells tears through the morning air with their distinctive whistling shriek, impacting among the American positions in brilliant flashes of orange flame and black smoke. The gunners work with practiced efficiency, loading, firing, adjusting based on the observations from forward spotters. This is German artillery at its finest, disciplined, precise, methodical. Each shell is placed exactly where it needs to be, conserving ammunition while maximizing effect. But something is wrong. Even as Müller's guns continue their bombardment, even as the shells continue to fall among the American positions with textbook accuracy, he hears something that makes his blood run cold. It is a sound that grows steadily louder. A sound that should not exist: the incoming whistle of American artillery shells. Not 1 or 2 ranging rounds, but dozens of them all arriving simultaneously with a coordination that seems impossible. The first American salvo impacts directly on Müller's battery position with devastating precision. The 155mm shells, each one weighing nearly 100 pounds, detonate in perfectly timed sequence, obliterating the carefully camouflaged gun positions in sheets of flame and twisted metal. Müller throws himself into a shell crater as shrapnel whistles overhead, his mind reeling with incomprehension. The Americans had found his position and engaged it with overwhelming firepower before his own guns had fired more than 6 rounds. It was impossible. His battery had been positioned with the utmost care, concealed from observation, beyond the range of American forward spotters. No enemy observer could have spotted his muzzle flashes in daylight conditions. No traditional counter-battery method could have located his guns so quickly or with such lethal accuracy. As Müller crawls through the snow toward what remains of his command post, dodging falling branches and red-hot metal fragments, he tries to make sense of what has happened. In 30 years of military service through campaigns in Poland, France, Russia, and now the Western Front, he has never experienced anything like this. The American artillery response had been instantaneous, accurate, and overwhelming. It was as if they had known exactly where his guns were positioned before he had fired a single shot. The historical context of this moment stretches back through 4 years of global warfare to the laboratories and proving grounds where American military technology had quietly revolutionized the ancient art of artillery, while German officers like Muller continued to fight the war with tactics and technologies that would have been recognizable to their predecessors in the First World War. American forces had developed systems that represented a quantum leap in military capability. The industrial and scientific capacity of the United States mobilized for total war had produced innovations that German commanders could barely comprehend, let alone counter. The foundation of American artillery superiority lay not in any single breakthrough, but in the integration of multiple technological advances that worked together to create an overwhelming advantage at forward observation posts scattered across the front lines. American artillery observers, equipped with radio sets, maintained constant contact with fire direction centers located miles behind the lines. These fire direction centers, staffed by officers trained in the latest mathematical techniques for calculating firing solutions, could coordinate the fires of dozens of batteries, simultaneously massing overwhelming firepower on any target within range. The Americans had gone far beyond traditional methods of artillery observation and fire control in concealed positions behind their lines. American sound ranging stations operated sophisticated equipment that could detect the acoustic signature of enemy artillery the moment it fired. Arrays of sensitive microphones connected by telephone lines to central plotting rooms recorded the sound waves from German guns and used triangulation to determine their exact positions within minutes of their first shot. German artillery officers trained to believe that their guns were safe from counter-battery fire as long as they remained beyond visual observation, had no idea that American technology could locate them through sound alone. Even more advanced were the flash spotting stations that used telescopic instruments to detect the muzzle flashes of enemy guns at distances of up to 10 kilometers. American observers positioned at carefully surveyed locations and equipped with precise instruments could take simultaneous bearings on enemy muzzle flashes and radio. Those bearings to plotting centers where the enemy gun positions were calculated with mathematical precision. What had once required hours of careful observation and calculation could now be accomplished in minutes. Most revolutionary of all was the American development of radar-based counter-battery systems. The SCR 584 radar, developed by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and mass-produced by American industry, could track incoming artillery shells in flight and calculate their point of origin with unprecedented accuracy. German artillery officers who had spent their careers learning to position their guns beyond enemy observation and to displace quickly after firing to avoid retaliation, found themselves facing an enemy who could locate their positions before their shells had even reached their targets. Integration of these technologies created a system of counter-battery warfare that German commanders found incomprehensible. American artillery units linked by radio networks and supported by sophisticated fire direction centers could bring devastating firepower to bear on any German position within minutes of its first shot. The traditional cat-and-mouse game of artillery warfare, where batteries fired a few rounds and then quickly displaced to avoid counter-battery fire, had been replaced by a system of overwhelming American firepower that struck with the speed and precision of a thunderbolt. German artillery doctrine, developed through decades of experience in 2 world wars, emphasized careful positioning, precise fire control, and rapid displacement after firing. German gunners were trained to husband ammunition, to place each shell exactly where it would do the most damage, and to avoid prolonged engagements that might expose their positions to enemy retaliation. This doctrine had served them well against enemies who fought by similar rules, where artillery duels were contests of skill and patience, with victory going to the side that could locate and engage enemy batteries first. But the Americans had changed the rules, entirely German officers like Müller expecting to fight a traditional artillery duel where concealment and rapid displacement would protect. Their guns instead found themselves facing an enemy who could locate their positions through methods they barely understood and engage them with firepower that dwarfed anything in their experience. The careful positioning and camouflage that had protected German artillery for decades became meaningless against American technology that could see through concealment and track guns through their acoustic and electronic signatures. The psychological impact of this technological disparity was as devastating as its tactical effects. German artillery officers, proud of their professional competence and confident in their methods, found themselves helpless against an enemy whose capabilities seemed to border on the supernatural. Reports from the front lines spoke of American artillery that could engage German positions with impossible accuracy of counter-battery fire that arrived within minutes of the first German shot. Of devastating bombardments that seemed to come from nowhere. Oberst Müller, pulling himself from the ruins of his battery position, represents the bewilderment of an entire generation of German officers confronted with American technological superiority. His battery, positioned according to all the principles of German artillery doctrine, had been obliterated by an enemy response that violated every rule of warfare as he understood it. The Americans had not only located his guns with impossible speed and accuracy, they had engaged them with overwhelming firepower that left no possibility of survival or escape. The contrast between German expectations and American reality reflected a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. German military doctrine, rooted in European traditions of professional competence and tactical sophistication, emphasized the efficient use of limited resources and the careful application of proven methods. German officers expected their enemies to fight by similar rules where skill and experience would ultimately determine victory. The Americans, drawing on their vast industrial capacity and their talent for technological innovation, had instead created new rules entirely. What Müller and his fellow officers could not comprehend was the scale of American industrial mobilization and its application to military technology. Behind every American artillery battery stood an industrial complex that dwarfed anything in German experience. American factories, converted from peacetime production to military purposes, produced not only vast quantities of artillery pieces and ammunition, but also the sophisticated electronic equipment that made American counter-battery fire so devastating. The sophisticated electronic equipment that made American counter-battery core so devastating. Same industrial system that had mass-produced automobiles and consumer goods now turned out radar sets, RADIO equipment, and fire control computers with the efficiency and quality that German officers found impossible to match. The technological disparity extended beyond individual pieces of equipment to encompass entire systems of warfare. American artillery units were supported by elaborate networks of communication supply and technical support that allowed them to maintain their equipment in peak operating condition and to coordinate their fires with unprecedented precision. German units operating at the end of supply lines stretched across occupied Europe and lacking the industrial base to maintain their equipment properly found themselves increasingly outmatched not only in quantity but in quality of performance. The doctrine of time on target artillery, developed by American forces and perfected through practice, represented everything that German officers found incomprehensible about American military methods. In a traditional artillery engagement, batteries would fire in sequence, allowing enemy forces time to take cover between salvos and opportunities to locate and engage the firing batteries. American time on target missions coordinated the fires of multiple batteries so that all shells would impact simultaneously, creating devastating concentrations of firepower that gave the enemy no warning and no opportunity to respond. The calculation and coordination required for time-on-target missions demanded a level of mathematical precision and communication sophistication that impressed even German officers who prided themselves on their technical competence, American fire direction centers equipped with mechanical calculators and manned by officers trained in advanced mathematical techniques, could coordinate the fires of dozens of batteries across hundreds of square kilometers, timing their shots so that shells fired from different positions and at different times would all arrive at the target simultaneously. The psychological effect of time-on-target bombardments was as important as their physical destruction. German soldiers accustomed to artillery fire that arrived in predictable patterns, allowing them to seek cover between salvos and to estimate when bombardments would end, found themselves facing sudden, devastating concentrations of firepower that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The simultaneous impact of dozens or hundreds of shells created not only massive physical destruction but also a sense of helplessness and terror that shattered unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. German officers analyzing American artillery methods in post-battle reports struggled to understand how their enemies could achieve such coordination and precision. The answer lay in American technological advantages that German forces lacked the industrial capacity to match. American radio networks more reliable and more widely distributed than German equipment allowed constant communication between fire direction centers and individual batteries. American fire control equipment, produced by an electronics industry that had no equivalent in wartime. Germany provided the calculating power necessary to coordinate complex fire missions. American abundance of ammunition and fuel allowed sustained operations at levels of intensity that German forces could not maintain. The symbolic power of American artillery extended beyond its tactical effectiveness to represent the industrial and technological superiority of American civilization itself. Each American shell that impacted on German positions carried with it the weight of American factories, American technology, and American abundance. The devastating accuracy of American counter-battery fire demonstrated not only superior equipment, but also superior training, superior communications, and superior integration of technology and tactics. German soldiers cowering in foxholes and bunkers as American shells fell around them. The enemy artillery became a symbol of everything they were fighting against and everything they could not match. The shells themselves, manufactured in vast American factories and shipped across the Atlantic in quantities that seemed unlimited, represented an industrial capacity that German propaganda had consistently underestimated. Precision with which they were delivered represented a level of technological sophistication that German officers had been trained to believe was impossible for such a young and supposedly inexperienced military force. The radios that coordinated American artillery fire operated on frequencies and with reliability that German forces could not achieve with their own equipment. The mathematical calculations that made time-on-target missions possible required a level of education and training that reflected American investment in technical education and scientific research. The industrial infrastructure that produced American artillery equipment in vast quantities represented an economic system that German leaders had consistently dismissed as decadent and inefficient, but which had proven capable of outproducing the combined industries of occupied Europe. As Oberst Müller stumbled through the snow away from the ruins of his battery position, he carried with him a revelation that would reshape his understanding of the war itself. The Americans were not simply another enemy to be defeated through superior German skill and determination. They represented a different kind of warfare entirely based on technological advantages that German forces could not match and industrial capacity that German production could not equal. The traditional German advantages of professional competence, tactical sophistication, and efficient use of resources had been rendered obsolete by American innovations that changed the fundamental nature of combat. The sound that would haunt Muller for the rest of his life was not the explosion of American shells or the screams of his wounded gunners, but the silence that preceded the devastating American response to his battery's fire. In that silence lay the electronic calculation of his gun's position, the coordination of multiple American batteries and the precise timing that would bring overwhelming firepower to bear on his position with surgical accuracy. It was the silence of American technology working with deadly efficiency, invisible and incomprehensible to an enemy trained to fight by older rules. The snow continued to fall as Muller made his way toward German lines, each step taking him further from the burning wreckage of his command and deeper into the realization that the war he had trained to fight no longer existed. The Americans had not simply improved upon traditional methods of warfare, they had created new methods, entirely based on technological advantages that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. The careful positioning and camouflage that had protected his battery according to all accepted principles of warfare had been meaningless against American systems that could locate and engage targets through methods that seemed like magic to officers trained in conventional warfare. In the weeks and months that followed, as German forces retreated across Western Europe under the weight of Allied technological superiority, the lesson of that January morning would be repeated thousands of times. German artillery batteries positioned according to traditional doctrine and manned by experienced crews would find themselves outmatched and overwhelmed by American systems that combined superior technology with unlimited industrial support. The professional competence and tactical skill that had carried German forces to victory in the early years of the war proved inadequate against an enemy that had changed the nature of warfare itself. The transformation of artillery from a weapon of area bombardment to a precision instrument of destruction represented more than a tactical innovation. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of modern warfare. The Americans had demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly applied to military technology, could create advantages that traditional military virtues could not overcome. The same scientific and industrial infrastructure that had made America the world's leading peacetime economy had been turned to military purposes with devastating effectiveness. German commanders, analyzing their defeats in the final months of the war, would consistently identify American artillery as more dangerous and more demoralizing than American tanks, aircraft, or infantry. The reason was not simply the destructive power of American guns, though that was formidable enough, but the systematic and inescapable nature of American artillery dominance. German forces could adapt their tactics to deal with American armor and aircraft, but they had no effective counter to artillery systems that could locate and engage any German position within minutes of its first shot. The radio networks that coordinated American artillery represented a level of communications sophistication that German forces never achieved despite their reputation for technical competence. American fire direction centers equipped with mechanical computers and manned by officers trained in advanced mathematical techniques could process targeting information and coordinate fire missions with speed and accuracy that impressed even German staff officers who considered themselves the world's experts in military efficiency. The industrial system that supplied American artillery units with unlimited ammunition and replacement equipment represented an economic achievement that German leaders had consistently underestimated. American factories converted from peacetime production with remarkable speed and efficiency produced not only the quantities of equipment necessary to supply American forces, but also the quality and sophistication necessary to maintain technological superiority. German industry, despite its reputation for precision and efficiency, could not match American production in either quantity or quality. Once American mobilization reached full capacity, the training system that produced American artillery officers and enlisted men represented an educational infrastructure that had no equivalent in wartime. Germany, American universities and technical schools mobilized for war production turned out thousands of officers trained in the mathematical and technical skills necessary to operate sophisticated fire control systems. American industry provided the practical experience and technical knowledge necessary to maintain and operate complex electronic equipment under combat conditions. The result was an artillery force that combined technological sophistication with practical competence in ways that German forces found impossible to match. The psychological impact of American artillery superiority extended far beyond its immediate tactical effects. German soldiers accustomed to fighting enemies, whose capabilities they understood and could counter, found themselves facing weapons, systems that seemed to violate the laws of warfare as they had learned them. Inability to hide from American counter-battery fire, the devastating accuracy of American time on target missions, and the unlimited supply of American ammunition created a sense of helplessness that undermined German morale and combat effectiveness. For German officers like Oberst Müller, trained in traditional methods of warfare and proud of their professional competence, the encounter with American artillery represented a crisis of confidence that extended beyond military tactics to encompass their understanding of warfare itself. Methods that had served them well in earlier campaigns proved not only inadequate but actively dangerous against an enemy who could locate and engage German positions through technological means that German doctrine had never considered. The sound-ranging stations that detected German artillery represented a level of acoustic science that German forces had not anticipated. The flash spotting systems that located German guns through optical means operated with precision and coordination that German camouflage could not defeat. The radar systems that tracked German shells in flight and calculated their point of origin represented technology that German intelligence had consistently underestimated. Integration of these systems into comprehensive counter-battery networks represented a level of military-industrial coordination that German forces could not match. The abundance that characterized American military operations became a symbol of everything that German propaganda had taught German soldiers to despise about their enemies, and everything that German forces could not overcome through traditional military virtues. The unlimited supplies of ammunition that allowed American artillery to maintain sustained bombardments represented an industrial capacity that German production could not equal. The sophisticated equipment that gave American forces technological advantages represented a scientific and educational infrastructure that German forces could not match. The coordination and precision that characterized American operations represented a level of military efficiency that German forces found increasingly difficult to counter. As the war entered its final phase, German officers would repeatedly report their inability to understand or counter American artillery methods, the traditional techniques of camouflage, displacement, and counter-battery fire that had protected German artillery in earlier campaigns proved inadequate against American systems that could locate and engage German positions through electronic and acoustic means that German doctrine had never considered. The result was not simply tactical defeat, but intellectual confusion that extended to the highest levels of German command. The legacy of American artillery superiority in World War II extended far beyond the tactical victories it achieved on European battlefields. The integration of scientific research, industrial production, and military operations that made American artillery so effective became the model for military development in the post-war era. The technologies developed for American artillery systems laid the foundation for the electronic and computer systems that would dominate warfare in subsequent decades. The industrial and educational infrastructure that supported American artillery became the basis for American technological leadership in the Cold War and beyond. For Oberst Müller, stumbling through the snow away from the ruins of his command the morning of January 17, 1945, represented more than a tactical defeat. It represented the end of an era in warfare itself. The methods and traditions that had guided military officers for centuries had been rendered obsolete by technological advances that changed the fundamental nature of combat. The professional competence and tactical skill that had been the foundation of military success were no longer sufficient against enemies who could harness industrial and scientific resources on scales that traditional military thinking had never contemplated. The silence that preceded the devastating American response to his battery's fire would echo through the remaining months of the war as German forces encountered American technological superiority in battle after battle. It was the silence of electronic calculation replacing human observation, of industrial abundance overwhelming tactical skill, of scientific innovation rendering traditional methods obsolete. It was the silence of a new age in warfare, announcing itself with devastating effectiveness against enemies who still fought by the rules of the old age. In the end, the story of German officers' inability to understand American artillery effectiveness represents more than a tactical puzzle from military history. It represents the collision between two different approaches to warfare and two different models of military organization. The German approach, based on professional competence, tactical sophistication, and efficient use of limited resources, had served well in conflicts between enemies of roughly equal technological capability. The American approach, based on industrial mobilization, technological innovation, and the systematic application of scientific research to military problems, represented a new model of warfare that would dominate the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The snow that fell on that January morning in 1945 covered not only the ruins of Oberst Muller's battery but also the remnants of a military tradition that stretched back centuries. The precision and devastation of American artillery fire announced the arrival of a new era in which victory would belong not to the most skilled or the most courageous, but to those who could most effectively harness the technological and industrial resources of modern civilization. The silence before the storm of American shells contained within it the sound of the future arriving with explosive force on the battlefields of the past. The radios that coordinated American fire crackling with precise targeting data across secure frequencies carried more than tactical information. They carried the voice of American democracy speaking through its technology. Each transmission represented not just military communication, but the integration of American scientific research, industrial production, and educational infrastructure into a system of warfare that German forces could comprehend, but could never match. The precision of American gunnery reflected not only superior equipment, but also superior training, superior coordination, and superior integration of human skill with technological capability, as Oberst Müller would learn in the years after the war, speaking with fellow officers in prisoner of war camps and later in the rebuilt German Federal Republic. His experience was not unique across every front where German forces encountered American artillery. The story was the same: devastating effectiveness that seemed to violate every principle of traditional warfare, technological superiority that rendered German defensive measures obsolete, and abundance of resources that made sustained resistance impossible. The American 155mm shells that destroyed his battery carried within their precisely timed fuses the culmination of years of American research into metallurgy, chemistry, and precision manufacturing. The radios that coordinated their delivery represented advances in electronics and communications that American industry had achieved through the systematic application of scientific research to military problems. The mathematical calculations that ensured their accuracy reflected an educational system that had produced thousands of officers capable of operating sophisticated technical equipment under combat conditions. But beyond the technical details lay a deeper truth that German officers struggled to accept. The Americans had not simply improved upon existing methods of warfare, but had created entirely new methods based on capabilities that German forces could not hope to match. The industrial system that supplied American artillery with unlimited ammunition represented economic resources that exceeded the combined production of occupied Europe. The scientific infrastructure that developed American military technology represented research capabilities that German forces could not duplicate even under peacetime conditions. transformation of warfare, represented by American artillery, went beyond questions of tactics and technology to encompass fundamental differences in national character and social organization. The Americans had demonstrated that a democratic society, properly mobilized for war, could achieve levels of military effectiveness that traditional military cultures could not match. The scientific research, industrial production, and educational infrastructure that made American artillery so effective were products of American society itself, not merely of American military organization. In the silence between the firing of German artillery and the arrival of devastating American counter-battery fire lay the sound of democracy defending itself with all the resources of modern civilization. The precision of American gunnery represented not only superior technology but also superior integration of diverse talents and capabilities into effective military organizations. The abundance of American supplies represented not only vast industrial capacity, but also the economic efficiency of free markets, mobilized for national defense. For German officers trained to believe in the superiority of professional military cultures over democratic societies, the effectiveness of American artillery represented a challenge to fundamental assumptions about warfare and society. The methods that had made German forces effective in earlier conflicts, professional competence, tactical sophistication, and efficient use of limited resources, proved inadequate against an enemy that could mobilize vastly superior resources and apply them with technological precision that German forces could not match. The snow continued to fall as Oberst Müller made his way toward German lines, each flake a reminder of the winter that would see German resistance collapse under the weight of Allied technological and material superiority. The sound of American artillery continuing its methodical destruction of German positions across the front carried with it the voice of a different kind of warfare based on different principles and capable of achieving results that traditional military thinking had never contemplated. In the end, the inability of German officers to understand American artillery effectiveness before encountering it in battle reflected more than intelligence failures or technological blindness. It reflected the difficulty of comprehending revolutionary changes in the nature of warfare itself. The Americans had not simply built better weapons, they had created new systems of warfare that integrated scientific research, industrial production, and military organization in ways that changed the fundamental relationship between technology and tactical effectiveness. The legacy of that January morning in 1945 extended far beyond the tactical defeat of a single German artillery battery. It represented the emergence of a new model of warfare that would dominate military thinking for decades to come, based on the systematic application of scientific and industrial resources to military problems. The silence before the storm of American shells contained within it the sound of the future announcing itself with devastating effectiveness against enemies who still fought by the rules of the pastas. Oberst Müller would reflect in the years after the war, the morning when his battery was destroyed by American counter-battery fire marked not just a tactical defeat but the end of his world. The professional military culture that had shaped his career and defined his understanding of warfare had been rendered obsolete by technological advances that he could understand but could never hope to match. The Americans had won not through superior courage or skill, but through superior integration of scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and military organization into systems of warfare that represented the future of human conflict. Sound that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond was not the explosion of artillery shells but the silence of electronic calculation, the quiet efficiency of industrial production, and the steady advance of scientific knowledge applied to military purposes. It was the sound of democracy mobilizing the full resources of modern civilization in defense of freedom, speaking through the devastating precision of American artillery to announce the arrival of a new age in human warfare. In that silence lay the future of warfare itself, arrived with explosive force on the battlefields of Belgium to demonstrate that victory in modern conflict would belong not to the most traditional or the most professional, but to those who could most effectively harness the technological and industrial resources of advanced civilization. The snow that covered the ruins of German artillery positions covered also the remnants of military traditions that stretched back centuries, replaced by new methods of warfare that would define conflict in the atomic age and beyond. Radios fell silent, the snow continued to fall, and in the distance, the methodical sound of American artillery continued its work, each precisely placed shell carrying with it the weight of American industry, American science, and American determination to create a world where such devastating effectiveness would serve the cause of freedom rather than conquest. Silence before each salvo contained within it the promise of victory achieved not through the ancient virtues of warfare, but through the modern miracle of democracy mobilized for the defense of civilization itself.